What is up, guys? This is Simon from Card Gaming. This is going to be part one of probably a 3 or 4-part video series about the new Branded Despia deck. This deck is an upcoming threat in the TCG. If you've been paying attention at all to the OCG, this has been their best deck for, I think, 2 formats straight, possibly even longer. And there's a lot of hype around this deck. It comes out in a little less than 2 weeks in the Albaz Strike Structure deck. And yeah, I'm just going to go over each of the new cards really quickly. I've tried recording this like 5 times so far, and I'm just gonna zoom through the cards because it's been like an hour-long video every time I've tried. So let's just jump into it. In this video, we're gonna cover the new cards, some tech options, and some ways you can kind of counter this deck. We're gonna do some deck building, so I'm going to build kind of a pure version of this deck, the Adventure Hybrid, and those are going to be the 2 most common versions you see in the TCG most likely. And then at the end, I'll also go over a quick kind of budget version for people who don't want to spend $150 on a copy of Valiper. So let's just go right in. First up is Branded Fusion. This is really important to talk about first because it's kind of the reason this deck is good now. This is a card in the structure deck. It fuses any fusion that lists Albaz as material, which is going to be a common trend you see for a lot of these cards, is that they rely on these kind of Albaz listed fusions. But it fuses from hand, deck, or field, and so the fact that you can fuse from deck is really, really good. The big drawback of this card is that you end up being fusion locked for the whole turn, including before you play this card. So if you like Link Summon, for example, you can't activate a Branded Fusion anymore. But because your fusions are so good, it doesn't really matter that much, and you're perfectly content just like turboing out these busted fusion monsters. And the advantage this card gets you is really, really powerful. So to understand why this card is good, we have to go over 3 of the fusions first. So there's Albion, Lubellion, and Mirror Jade. Albion requires Albaz and a light monster, and Lubellion requires Albaz and a dark monster. So that means that Branded Fusion is a foolish burial for any light or dark monster in your deck, which is really, really good. There's a lot of ways you can kind of play this out, and the Despia cards in particular make really good use of this utility. Both of these cards have an additional trigger effect that fusion summons again when you summon them. So Albion has like a Miracle Fusion. It banishes the materials from your hand, field, and grave. And Lubellion is kind of like a Thunder Dragon Fusion. It returns the materials from your graveyard, field, and banished back to your deck. So the typical turn 1 play for this deck is you're going to use Branded Fusion to summon Lubellion, which is going to dump Albaz and a Dark Monster to your grave, typically one of the Despia cards. Lubellion is going to activate to fusion summon again, and you're going to shuffle back the Lubellion itself and the Albaz you just sent back into your deck to summon the new boss monster of the deck, Mirror Jade. And so the fact that Lubellion recycles your Albaz means that Albaz is kind of a brick in this deck. You typically only want to play 1 because you can just keep putting it back with the Lubellion. Mirror Jade is another one of the reasons this deck is really, really good now. This is really the monster you want to be summoning almost every game. It's the monster that gives you follow-up and is also just a really irritating boss monster. It needs Albaz plus a Fusion Synchro, Xyz, or Link. So typically this is going to be Albaz and a Fusion, though you can bring it out other ways. And it's got some really powerful effects. So first of all, it has a quick effect non-targeting banish for any monster in the field, which in itself is amazingly strong. But the cost for activating this effect is dumping a fusion monster that lists Albaz as material from your extra deck to graveyard. So this is also really, really good because most of the Albaz fusions do something in the graveyard during the end phase that they're sent there. So they have some kind of floating effect. So in particular, like Albion, for example, if this is in the graveyard because it was sent there this turn, you can add to your hand or set a branded spell or trap directly from your deck. So this is really, really good. This fetches one of the key disruptive pieces in the deck, which is the branded spell traps, typically branded in red. And it means that Mirror Jade is not only disruption, but it's also follow-up. And that's where this deck really kind of shines. It's not only the fact that it's got a very sticky engine, but it also like generates an insane amount of follow-up advantage. It has kind of a weird restriction where you can't use the effect of Mirror Jade on back-to-back turns, but the way that this is worded on Dueling Book is a bit misleading. The actual TCG text is a little bit clearer. It says something like, this card cannot use this effect next turn. And that's actually really important because it means that if you summon a Mirror Jade and use the effect and then you get rid of it and you bring it back, you can use the effect again the next turn or even the same turn. So it's not like a named effect, right? It's not like you can only use the effect of Mirror Jade once per turn. So that's going to be a key interaction that we're going to abuse in this deck. Finally, if it's fusion summoned and it leaves the field by your opponent, so whether that's by battle or by card effect or even by a kaiju, you can activate this effect and it nukes your opponent's entire or other monsters during the end phase. So the way this effect is worded is similar to kind of how DPE works, in the sense that this activates as soon as Mirror Jade leaves the field, and then an event happens at a later point in time without activating. So kind of like how when DPE dies, the effect is activated, and then the next standby phase, it comes back without doing anything. Mirror Jade is the same, and that makes it really hard to interact with. Because, for example, let's say like if you're playing Tri-Brigade, and you go and make a Zeus, and you Zeus their whole board, and Mirror Jade triggers, and as soon as that resolves successfully, that end phase Raigeki is happening, and you are not going to be able to stop it. So if you build your whole board in main phase 2, and you summon your Appaloosa and whatever, in the end phase, Mirror Jade will just nuke everything, and there's no way for you to respond to it. And that means that Mirror Jade is actually really, really obnoxious to play around, because you have to kind of get rid of it while being like mindful of its effect. So there's 3 realistic ways that you can play around this. The first is by just negating it when it activates. So the easiest way to do that is with a card like Skullmeister or Called by the Grave. You can just chain it to that effect and it'll negate it, of course. The second way is to just kill the branded player. So if you get rid of the Mirror Jade and then you just kill them, and that's very simple, and you never have to get to the end phase and you just win. And then the third way is to return Mirror Jade or to move Mirror Jade to a location where it can't activate that effect. So typically that'll mean it'll be face down. So either back to the extra deck or banished face down through a card like Evenly Matched. But in general, because this boss monster is so sticky and its disruption is so good, and it also gives you advantage, this is one of the key components of the deck. Alright, that was a lot. And now it's time to get into the main deck. We're going to go through these pretty quick. Yeah, you're going to see the Despia cards played with the branded cards most often because it just has the most synergy by far. And you'll really start to see why the cards are so good together once we actually get into them. So first off is Aliber. I really hope you've picked these up by now, because if you haven't, then you should be prepared to spend upwards of $400 on a playset of Aliber in the US. It's honestly ridiculous. But this card is just by far the best searcher of Branded Fusion, and it's not even close. So this searches any branded spell trap from your deck to your hand on normal or special summon. So that's all very relevant, because being able to grab not only Fusion, but also your other branded cards is really, really good. And not a lot of other Fusion searchers will do that. So like the Predaplants don't do that. Keeper of Dragon Magic doesn't do that. So being able to grab a card like Branded in red is really, really important. The fact that it triggers in special summon means that you can play this with a card like Branded Opening that special summons it from the deck, and that means you can also play this with the Adventure Engine, because you're not forced to normal summon Aliber anymore. So both of these, all of the wording in this effect is very, very important. And it's really just played for that effect. It has a secondary effect that it kind of like, it's like a floating effect, and it comes back and it negates something, but it's not that important to know. It definitely comes up, but the main reason you play it is a searching. And the revival is less important than you think it is, because you can only use one of its effects per turn, and you can't use both. So you can't bring it back on the opponent's turn with its own effect and then trigger the search. It'd be a little too good if that was the case. But regardless, Aliber is still one of the best cards in the deck. Even one copy of Aliber will just make your Despia cards way, way stronger, and you play this card in every version of the deck pretty much. Next up is Tragedy. Basically, when you send Tragedy to the grave with a card effect, you can search a Despia monster, and usually that's Aliber. What that means is that when you go Branded Fusion, you can dump Tragedy. Tragedy will get Aliber, and then Aliber will get another branded card. So there's a lot of like cyclical recursion in this deck. It's a very, very recursive engine that gives you a lot of card advantage, and it means that once this deck gets going, it's really hard to stop. So that's the main utility of Tragedy. This also triggers off being discarded off a card like Dirty of Destiny, for example. As long as you send it to the grave with a card effect, you can get the search, which is excellent. In the grave, you can banish it from your grave and then reset a branded spell trap, and that's just another form of recursion. And again, most of the Despia cards, you can only use one of their effects per turn, but that's okay, because these are both fantastic effects. Comedy is next up. This one is kind of a weird one. We might not see this played, but this card ended up becoming pretty standard in the OCG. So it has 2 effects. The first effect is kind of like Soraviz. If they activate an effect that targets a Despia card you control, usually Aliber, you can discard Comedy and it'll protect it. So if you basically this protects Aliber from Valor and Imperm, which is cool. It's not honestly that great, but because cards like Branded Opening, this also adds Despia monsters to hand, you can search cards like Comedy, you can protect your Aliber. The graveyard effect is arguably more important. If it's in your grave, then as a quick effect, you contribute a fusion monster and you can bring out Comedy. So this lets you dodge Imperm on your important fusion effects like Lubellion and sometimes Albion, but typically Lubellion is when you want to protect. So when you bring out Lubellion, you're trying to fusion summon again, usually to bring out your Mirror Jade. And if this gets negated, then you're in a lot of trouble, because your Albaz is stuck in the graveyard. and you need your Albaz to be in the deck to keep using your branded cards. So being able to protect your Lubellion is just a really, really cool niche of a card like Comedy, and it wouldn't surprise me to see this card played in a lot of lists just for that reason. Next up are the high-level Despias. There's Adlib and there's Dramaturge. And on paper, Dramaturge seems like the better one. So both of these cards do something when you fuse with them from hand or field, not from deck, because that'd be a little too good, but you have a lot of ways to fuse from hand or field in this deck. Dramaturge, when you fuse with it from hand or field, it brings itself back to the field. It has 3,000 attack, and it's essentially, if your opponent summons a Fusion Synchro, Xyz, or Link, you can negate any of their monsters on the field until the end of the turn, which is really solid. It's disruption, and it's got a lot of stats. But Adlib is really the star of the show. When you fuse with this from hand or field, it summons back either your Despia monster or your level 8 or higher fusion monster that is banished or in your grave. So if you remember what we talked about earlier with Mirror Jade being able to use this effect more than once on back-to-back turns or even on the same turn, the way you do that is with a card like Adlib, where your kind of bread and butter play in this deck is to use Mirror Jade and then to remove it from the field with a card like Branded in red, and then you'll bring it back with a card like Adlib, and you'll turn the banish on again. So that's a really core interaction in this deck. So Adlib is very standard in almost all branded lists, and Dramaturge is usually not played, although I think you can make a case for playing one of this card in more pure versions. But Adlib is definitely the standard. And then finally Albaz himself. This card is typically a brick. It has a fusion effect where you fuse with your opponent's monster, but it's easy to disrupt, and if they get rid of Albaz, then you've just kind of lost 2 cards. Because you have to discard a card as cost. So this is almost typically always run at just 1 copy because you don't really want to be drawing this. You want to be fusing with this from deck with fusion whenever possible. And you can make a case for playing more than one of this as well, but I would expect to see most lists on 1, especially if you're playing the Adventurer list, which really needs to cut down in space as much as possible. Next up are the spell traps. We've already talked about Branded Fusion, but the other core player in the deck is Branded in red. This is a quick play fusion spell where you first add back a Despia monster or Volume of Albaz in your graveyard, and then you bring it back to your hand, and then you fuse using cards from your hand or field, and they get banished. So the intended way to play this card is you use this to make sure you can always trigger your Adlib and your Dramaturge. You just add them back to hand and then fuse with them from the hand. So that's pretty neat already. You may have seen players like Pac and Vlad play pre-structure deck Despia, and that deck is really just Guardian Chimera Turbo because you're just abusing Branded in red to summon Guardian Chimera. This is a card in Battle of Chaos. You fuse with monsters from your hand and field, and then you will draw cards equal to the cards you used in hand, and then you will destroy your opponent's cards equal to the cards you fused from field. So, for example, if you fused with 2 Despias in hand and then your Mirror Jade on the field, you'll be able to draw 2 cards and then pop 1. So your Branded in red into Chimera play is kind of a stable turn 2 interaction that will give you follow-up and also disrupt the opponent. And because you'll have a boss monster like Mirror Jade on the field and also a set spell trap like Branded in red, it means that your threats are kind of spread out, and it's actually really annoying to try to to kind of prevent this deck from doing stuff on turn 2. So it means that it's hard to deal with. It's kind of like when Pranked has like a Griffin Rider and also like a set Pandemonium, and it's hard to punish those effectively. So this is the core disruption of the deck, and the others are not as noteworthy. Opening is typically E-Telly. You can summon an Aliber. I mentioned before you can also add to hand, so cases where that's useful is you can add a Comedy to your hand, and then you can use that to protect your Aliber. You can also, if you're against Floowandereeze and they have the Barrier statue, you can Opening to search Aliber instead of special summoning it, and then you can just normal summon it and then attack over the Barrier statue, which is pretty cool. This has a cool effect in the graveyard where this is it's semi-grade Balinks for all your cards. If your fusion monster would be destroyed by card effect, you can just banish Opening from the grave. This is actually really, really relevant in the mirror match because your Mirror Jades are going to be triggering all over the place in the mirror match, and you can banish Opening to protect all your fusions, which is pretty important. And then finally, a card that's not really played anymore. This is the Counter Trap. This is basically Solemn Warning. Not much to say about this one. I'm fond of this card, but I would expect to see this not played in most Despia lists, once they get optimized at least, just because you don't really need it. There's a lot of really good branded spell traps that are just good, but they're not as good as Fusion or Branded in Red, and so the problem is you never want to really be searching them. You want to be hard opening them, but then you have to be able to have a playable hand if you hard open them, and it just typically means that they don't get played. So that's that. And that's basically all the core cards you need to know. I will go over some combos in a follow-up video, so you'll really get to see how these cards play together. But it's sure to be pretty clear how much like resource generation there is in this deck. It's kind of like Salamangreat on crack, where you'll always have your turn 1 with the boss monster and then more follow-up to do the same thing again next turn. It's a very like mid-range playstyle, but very aggressive and hard to deal with. So what tech options do you have in this deck? There's quite a couple, and you can certainly play this deck pure, and I know some people have been very fond of that, especially with the pure Despia like Frightfur list that's been being played a bit more recently. But the most dominant variant in the OCG by far was the Adventurer variant, and this caught on very quickly after the first ban list that they had that semi-limited both Right and Enchantress. Even despite that, this variant was almost exclusively the only variant played in the OCG. Even post the most recent ban list where they actually limited Right and Enchantress, you will still see a lot of Adventurer Despia. And it's just that good, which is nuts to me, honestly. But the idea is really simple. All of these cards that the Branded deck plays are actually really hard to stop, except for Ash on Branded Fusion. Ash on Branded Fusion is probably the single most impactful thing you can do against this deck. And this deck doesn't really have a way to keep playing after Fusion gets ashed. And so one of the no-brainer ways to play around this is you just play cards that beat Ash. And Right is one of those cards. So you'll set up a Griffin Rider before doing all your Despia stuff, and then you can either just slam Branded Fusion, or you can play an opening and you can grab Alibur, and then you can get Fusion that way. So the cards just work really well together. Another minor weakness of the pure deck is that you have basically no way to link summon, because not only are the cards kind of xenophobic, they lock you into fusions, but also you don't really have a way to get 2 monsters on the field without fusion locking yourself in the first place. And so the Adventurer cards kind of mitigate that a bit, because you can go just, Link Spider plus a monster into a Verte Anaconda, and you'll be able to get your engine from there. It's not going to be as good as just activating Branded Fusion, but you can go Verte, dump Fusion, and then just make Mirror Jade directly, because Verte is a Link monster, and you can fuse Verte plus Albaz, which is not great, but it's better than nothing. And then, of course, if you are playing DPE in Fusion Destiny, this is another option you can certainly play in this deck, and it's definitely a viable way to approach this. And it shouldn't be surprising, because you do see Right and DPE played in so many decks currently. This is not really something that the OCG ever had to deal with, because they had banned Fusion Destiny on the same list that Right went to, so you didn't really see that in their lists. But for us, I know some people have been debating kind of whether it's worth it to play all these bricks for both engines, but personally I think it makes a lot of sense to play both. And DPE does actually have a bit of synergy in the deck as well. You can bring it back with cards like Ad Libitum. If you, for example, if they manage to out your DPE loop, you can just get access to it right back again later with Ad Lib, which is really good. So yeah, these cards are pretty solid. We're going to be building a version of this deck later in the video. Next up is Dragoon. This is also playable. This is, again, something that you never saw in the OCG because they had banned Dragoon quite a while ago. But you can Branded Fusion and dump your Albaz and your Dark Magician to summon your Lubellion, because Dark Magician is a dark monster. And then because Albaz is a dragon, you can actually put this and the Dark Magician back with Lubellion to summon your Dragoon. And it'll have 1 pop because you summon it with 1 normal monster. So this is an option. I don't think it's very good, frankly, because I think Dragoon gets a lot worse when Mirror Jade comes out, just because this card inherently outs Dragoon by itself, and you just don't need it, really. It doesn't really add anything to your deck, and it also cuts off your resource advantage because you're not generating more with Mirror Jade. So it's playable. You might see it in some decks as kind of an unexpected option, but you really don't need to, in my opinion. Next up is the Patchwork engine. This is Frightfur Patchwork, Adjunct Chain, and Polymerization. You may have seen this in current format Despia lists. If you can look at like Pack's channel or Vlad's channel, they have both featured like Despia lists playing this. It just gives you a lot of cards. And one thing about this deck is that you do tend to bleed a lot of cards from the hand because Lubellion requires a discard. And so this is just another way to get to those. And you can do some cool stuff with Polymerization that involves making cards like Dracos Depelia, for example. and it just gives you a lot of card advantage and a little more versatility, but it is a bit intensive on deck space. It's like 6 to 8 cards depending on how big of an engine you play, and one of my problems with this is that it doesn't get you started if your fusion gets negated, and you also typically won't see this played with the adventure engine just because it's too many cards. So you'll typically see this in Pure, but then Pure's biggest problem is not being able to resolve Branded Fusion, and Patchwork very sometimes helps with that, but usually doesn't. So this is an option. Next up are the Predaplants. These cards come out in Dimension Force, so this is quite a bit ways off for us, but this is similar to the Frightfurs in that they give you another way to kind of fuse from the field, and there's some pretty neat combos with these cards as well. Biblisp is kind of like Tragedy. You just search a Predaplant when you send it to the graveyard, so you dump this with Branded Fusion, and you get access to your whole engine. And this is a pretty unexplored variant. It's gotten some recent tops in the OCG after Right went to 1. And the cool thing is that in the TCG, we have 3 copies of Orpheus Scoprio, and we also still have Fusion Destiny plus DPE at almost full power. It's at 2 copies, whereas in the OCG, this card is at 1 copy. So this could be cool in a couple months' time, but again, this comes out in the next main set, so it's not going to be instantly relevant to us. Next up are the Dogmatic cards. This is also something that you didn't see much in the OCG because they had hit Nadir. We have 2 copies here, and Maximus is in general just a good card. The idea is that you go into your Fusion monster, and then you Nadir for Maximus, you summon Maximus, and you dump cards that search more Albaz cards. So cards like Tri-Brigade Mercurier, this is just a negate if you have a Fusion monster that lists Albaz as material. So you just search this, and you have a really hard to interact with negation in the end phase. So that's pretty solid, I think, but the problem is that similar to Frightfur, your Nadir Servant is not a play starter in this deck. Opening just Nadir and no branded cards does not get you rolling, and that's kind of you can send stuff like Albion for next turn, but it doesn't get you rolling on the same turn. I would probably not expect to see this played, but it is certainly an option. And then last up are 2 variants. The branded cards are pretty xenophobic because they do fusion lock you, so you're not going to be doing any link climbing in this deck. But 2 variants you can play this in. One is Outlich. It's pretty straightforward. You just use branded fusion and then you have Outlich cards. And it's really simple as that. It's a bit more budget than playing the full Despia version because you can actually cut all the normal summons and just play branded fusion and an Albaz. And just do it that way. You can even dump Lord with fusion to summon Albion, and that's definitely some synergy there. So this could be cool, especially on a budget. I think this is certainly a viable variant. The other one is Branded Tri-Brigade, which is a really interesting deck that if you actually want to learn more about, you should check out Ozone TCG's channel. I'll link to their video in the description going over this deck, but it's a pretty popular hybrid in the OCG that plays the new Tri-Brigade Mercurier. This comes out in the structure deck as well. And you actually sometimes don't even summon Mirror Jade in that deck. You will just use the new cards as kind of a way to get more cards and to resolve the effect of cards like Bear Brum to special summon. But that's going to close out the actual tech section. We're going to go really quickly over the extra deck cards that we haven't covered yet before we do some deck building. So we've talked about the first 3 fusions here and also about Chimera. Chimera is really the key piece that you summon off Branded in red. What will typically happen is you're going to have an Adlib in hand and a Mirror Jade either on the field or already banished, and you're going to fuse your Adlib away with Branded in red to summon either Chimera or Predaplant Draco's Tapelia, and that will trigger your Adlib to bring back your Mirror Jade. So Chimera is a disruption and follow-up, but the other really important one is Draco's Tapelia. This card is probably the most important card in the extra, that's aside from these 4. And this is just a negate for a monster your opponent controls, more or less. Negates only activated effects, so it doesn't negate anything continuous, which is actually surprisingly relevant. And this card is also really easy to bring out with Super Poly, so that's going to be important for the mirror as well. This card is just better than Chimera in some matchups, so I think Floowandereeze is the main one that comes to mind, where you would prefer this over a card like Chimera. And it's just really solid, especially if you play like Frightfur cards, for example, because your Poly will let you summon Draco's Tapelia on turn 1 without really lowering your ceiling at all, so that's important. Next up are 2 of the Despia related fusions. These both list a Despia monster as material. There's Caritis, which is not actual disruption, but it does have a floating effect when your opponent gets rid of it. It either special summons an Albaz or a Despia monster from your deck, and that's important mostly in the mirror match. if they have a card like Mirror Jade or Guardian Chimera or even DPE, which doesn't target and is trying to get rid of your cards, if you can manage to summon a Caritas and you can force them to get rid of it, you can fuse, or you can summon your own Albaz from deck and then fuse with their monster and really turn the tide of the game. So I would play this. It doesn't seem that good at first, but it's definitely important for a lot of game states in the mirror. The other one is Masquerade. This card is kind of like Red Eye's Flare Metal Dragon, I think, where they have to pay life points to do stuff. This card seems really, really good to bring out multiples of. Sometimes you've seen like videos of Despia players who summon like triple Masquerade with the idea that like you can't play if you're activating 1800 life points per card effect, but in reality it's just better to kind of play the deck normally. I would still play at least one because there's kind of a soft OTK you can do with Branded Fusion, where you summon, I think it's Alibur plus Albion plus Masquerade, and that is 6,800 damage, so that leaves him with only enough life points to play one more card, essentially. And it's almost impossible to win in that position. So that's important. DP, like I mentioned, this is a tech option if you play Fusion Destiny. I don't think you have to, especially because like if you play Pure, you can't really make Verte that often, so it's harder to access this if you don't hard open it. But on the flip side, you do play Prosperity, and in the Adventure Hybrid, for example, you'll have very easy access to Verte. Next up are Striker Dragon and Relinquished Anima. These are kind of weird options, but they're pretty common in the OCG. Basically, you just turn one of your bricks into a monster to put that brick in the graveyard, and that will turn on your Branded in red. So if you open Albaz, for example, and you don't have any plays, you can play your Albaz, make a Striker Dragon, and you can set Branded in red. And then on the opponent's turn, you can Branded in red to fuse your Albaz and your Striker Dragon into your Lubellion, and you can get going that way. So that's better than nothing. Anima is for your level 1s like Tragedy and Comedy. The obvious downside is you don't get any access to your Mirror Jade this way because these are not Albaz. It's better than nothing, like I said. So you'll typically see one of these, probably not both, and you don't really have to play either. Obviously in Adventure, you would play Link Spider as well. And in Adventure, you'd also play Verte. I think you do also play this in Pure just because it comes up. Like it's not that common that you make Verte in Pure, but I think it's important to play. Like you'll miss it in the games where you don't have it. And then Dark is also another similar option along that line, where it's kind of a card that you may not summon that often in Pure, but it comes up enough in certain game states, especially in hybrids, to warrant playing. And a really cool part about Dark is that not only does this search follow-up if it dies, but you can also like grab your opponent's DPE, and then you can fuse away the DPE with Branded in red, and that will banish it permanently. So cool stuff like that. There's more cards you could play, of course, but I think this video is already going a bit longer than I wanted it to, so we're going to go right into the deck building section. So what would a pure version of this deck look like? Well, let's just try to cut all of these cards in the text over here, and we'll just go ahead and try to build something. We definitely want to be maxing out on the cards that get us to Branded Fusion. So we want 3 Alibur for sure. I think there's going to be some debate, especially at the start of the format, about the quantities of most of these cards. So Comedy, I think, is going to be pretty contested as to whether you play this or not. I think people are going to try 1 Tragedy, but the OCG generally plays 2 because you kind of need the second for longer grind games, especially the mirror match. If you have the second Tragedy and your opponent doesn't, it can be a massive swing for you in terms of just overall how well you're able to grind out. I think 1 ad lib is going to be very standard. You never really need 2. If you resolve with the first one, you're in a really good spot already, and if you really need to resolve it again, you can put it back in the deck with Rebellion and access it again later. Dramaturge, I think, will probably not see play as much as I like this card. It's pretty fun to play with, and the negation is cool. I'm going to leave 1 copy in because I think it's just a fun card to work with, and you can summon this up opening. It's probably not optimal though, so I would not expect to see this in lists. And then Comedy, I think people will probably try to cut, but I would hinge on this card probably making it into most lists. I could be very wrong about this, we'll see. But I think 1 copy is nice to have. It helps you just play around cards like Imperm on your Lubellion without needing to invest stuff like your Brave Engine or your Crossout into negating that kind of stuff. So I think Comedy is nice. I think the last really contentious point is how many Albaz do you play? Because there's a good argument for 2, which is that if somehow your Albaz ends up in the grave or gets banished, I think you're in a really, really bad spot, especially if it's banished, because it's basically impossible to recover it from the banished. Playing 2 is insurance in that regard, but I think you can get away with 1, especially if you have answers to the cards that would leave Albaz stuck somewhere. which Adventurer would, and if you're on Pure, you play Crossout. That's another thing that you can do to protect your entire combo to make sure your Rebellion goes off. And this card is just not good to draw. Like, on paper, the effect to fuse from both fields is nice, but it's just never a good card to draw in almost any situation. So I would expect 1 to be standard. Branded Fusion, of course, we want to play 3 copies of this. We probably want to play 3 copies of most of these cards, the spells at least. We want 3 Branded in red. You could probably play 2. I think people will try cutting this to 1 as well, but I think you want 2 Branded in red for longer games in a similar sense that you would want 2 Tragedy. Even though Tragedy can reset your Branded in red, I just think having multiple is important. And then Opening could probably be 2 in Pure as well, but I think it's just a cool card to have, especially with Comedy. And if you play Dramaturge, I think you need 3 as well. So we're going to play 3 of all of these. The other spell traps, I think you can make a case for Theater, for the Counter Trap, and for, where is it? Branded Paradise, I think? But this card is basically Magical Meltdown, but it searches after you fuse, not before, so it's not a starter. So I think you can make a case for any of these 3 cards. I'm most fond of the Counter Trap, so I will play 1 in the Pure list, but in Optimized lists, I would expect to see none of them make the cut, because these other 3 spells are just typically better in most scenarios to search. So that is the archetypal lineup. What else do we want in here? We want Called By for sure, because we want some kind of insurance against Ash Blossom. And we want to play Prosperity, because this deck does a pretty good job at playing Prosperity. You can banish a lot of the fluff in the extra deck, like your links, you can banish 2nd and 3rd copies of your fusions, and it's just a really easy card to play, and you can also dig for your Branded Fusion, which is crucial. And then we might want Foolish Burial or a 2nd Albaz or something. I'm going to put Foolish in this list because the main utility is you can dump Comedy, sometimes also Tragedy, but that's not ideal in most cases. This is definitely more important in Adventurer for dumping Enchantress, and I think it's still justifiable in Pure. Another card that OCG sometimes plays is Gold Sarcophagus to banish the Tragedy, because this triggers when it gets banished as well as sent to the grave, but I'm not going to run that here. We have 16 slots left, so I think you could conceivably play your 4 favorite hand traps as 12 cards, and then just shove in Fusion Destiny and call it a day. I think that is totally viable. I think you could also not play Fusion Destiny, you could play Crossout, you could play any number of staple cards to fill up the rest, but what you're looking at here is really the deck core, honestly. And rather than go ahead and build the extra, I'm actually going to just tab to an existing Despia list I already have built. So this is kind of what I would expect Pure Despia to look like. Let's maybe cut the 2nd Albaz and put in a Foolish Burial instead, just for the sake of it. And I think this is a pretty standard list. I think you're going to see a lot of fiddling with the ratios early on, so don't take this as final by any regard, but this is a totally serviceable list here. The extra deck is a bit wonky. I think I haven't updated this. I would definitely cut the Sprint, and I don't think you need 2 DPE. It's actually pretty funny though, because this deck can play 2 DPE, because Lubellion summons fusions generically. So what you can actually do is you can Fusion Destiny for DPE, you can banish your Celestial and your Dasher to draw 2, and then on a later turn you can summon a Lubellion and shuffle back your Destiny Hero Garnets to summon a 2nd DPE from the extra deck, which is really, really funny. It virtually never comes up though, because you're usually in a completely winning position if you can do that. So I don't think you need to play 2. But yeah, this is a quick example of what Pure would generally look like. If we wanted to adapt this to an Adventurer list, let's take a look at what that would be. We would want to cut a couple cards. So definitely the extraneous cards we talked about. Dramaturge is definitely gone. The Counter Trap is gone. And Pure generally plays 3 Opening and 2 Alibur, because hard Opening Alibur is not nearly as good. It conflicts with your entire Adventurer engine. So you ideally want to bring this out through Opening when you have both engines. And then we can look at Adventurer Token. We want to max out on basically everything, so we want to max out on 3 Right, 3 Enchantress, Griffin Rider, Journey of Destiny, and Dracoback. So this puts us at 46 cards. I think the list I played for the most recent Zodiac tournament was on 2 Branded in red. You could probably play 3. I know a lot of the OCG plays 3 in this hybrid, but I like 45 as a number, and I actually won that tournament, so this is basically the list that I got first place with. I played a different side deck and slightly modified extra, but it definitely performed for me. It's a really strong hybrid, and the cards work smoothly. You could cut this to 40, and probably just maybe cut excess hand traps, and conceivably cut cards like Comedy. You could arguably cut 2nd Tragedy. You could even cut like 7th or 6th copies of Right, because you just prioritize hitting 40 cards and seeing Branded Fusion more often, which I think is all totally defensible. But this is a pretty, I guess, standard version of what I would expect this deck to look like, maybe with different hand traps or staples. And then the extra deck would need modification. Of course, you would want to play Link Spider for Verte Anaconda, and you would want to change up the side deck. You probably would not play Gozen in this, for example. Again, the second DP is not really played, but this is just a quick summary, I think, of what this would look like. Finally, in the deck building section is going to be more of a budget version you could potentially play for a budget of maybe $100 to $150. If you're not familiar, I do write a budget deck series on Reddit, on the Yu-Gi-Oh subreddit, so this is on there. Essentially, you are playing Spring Against Kit as a really like dollar store version of Alibur. This card is in the structure deck. It searches a branded spell or trap, but then you have to put a card from your hand back to the bottom of your deck, so this is really intensive on your hand. And it's also not a Despia card, so you can't grab this off your tragedy. So it's definitely a lot worse than Alibur, but it is still, in my opinion, the best Branded Fusion searcher that's not Alibur, just because you can search Branded in red. And I think that makes it just infinitely better. It's a similar concept. I think you still play the Despia cards just because of how good they are. You can still kind of abuse this ad-lib Mirror Jade interaction, even if you don't play Alibur. And then you fill the rest with cards like Patchwork. I think Patchwork is important in this version because you are just getting rid of so many cards with both Kit and Lubellion. You need the extra card advantage, and Patchwork does a great job of doing that. And then, of course, also the Polymerization is potentially a combo piece. And then the rest is like luxury. It's whatever hand traps you want. If you have Ash and you didn't pay $30 for it, you can play Ash in this deck. You can play Theater if you wanted to. You can play Condemnation if you wanted to. These are kind of just flex tech options. You don't have to play them. And I think this altogether comes out to under $150. And it's mostly cards from the structure. I am playing one copy of Guardian Chimera because it is just so good with Branded in red, but I know that Chimera has also been going up and up lately. I think it went from like $15 to over $35. So if this card becomes inaccessible, then you just have to cut it. It's unfortunate, but there's not really much you can do. I do think Chimera is probably the single most impactful purchase you can make for this version of the deck. And then, of course, Alibur is the next most impactful. But yeah, this is something that will do very well at a locals environment for a pretty small investment. And then, of course, if you wanted to look at like a 3 copies of the structure deck version, like a much more cheap version of this, there's plenty of channels on YouTube that have probably covered that already. I think Exordio already has a video on that, so you should check that out as well. To close out the video, let's talk about some ways you can kind of stop this deck. There's 2 cards that are somewhat similar. There's Super Poly and there's Branded Exile. Exile comes out in the next main set, Dimension Force, so this is not relevant for current format, but it will be relevant in a couple months' time. And this basically revives a fusion monster or a Despia monster in your grave, and then you fusion summon using monsters from either field, so it's kind of like Super Poly. They're pretty similar. Both of these cards are just really big momentum swings. You will be taking your opponent's monsters and using them to make your own fusion monsters, which just results in like a loss of their resources and a gain in yours. It's just really powerful. The mirror is really kind of a clown fiesta. Because you have these Mirror Jades that are popping off on like every turn, and both players' boards are getting wiped every turn, and you really have to just kind of out-resource your opponent. And in a mirror match like that, these tempo swings that result in like one player like taking control during the other player's turn, those are really important. And cards like Exile and Super Poly are examples of those. Exile being, I think, a little more popular in the OCG because even going second, you can play this card and you can set it and you don't have to discard anything. Another card in that vein is Dimensional Barrier. I forgot to put this in here, but this is definitely a really noteworthy option against this deck. Even again, turn 2, turn 3, you want to be shutting off their access to their Branded Fusion on the following turn, and the barrier is perfect for that. So these are all pretty powerful momentum swings, and I think you'll see a non-zero amount of play for all of them. Next up are hand traps. I've listed a couple here, and they range from being good to not very good. Ash is the most obvious because Ash and Branded Fusion is instantly just the most straightforward way to stop this deck. If they don't have a way to stop Ash, you basically stop their turn in most cases. There are some very niche cases where you don't stop their turn, but typically Ash is going to be the most impactful hand trap against his entire engine. You have Bell and Diddy Crow. These cards are both really solid against the end board, because the typical end board is going to be some threat on the field, usually like a Mirror Jade or something, and then Branded in red will be set almost all of the time if they manage to get playing. And so because Branded in red adds back from the graveyard, you can Bell this, and you can also Crow the thing that they target in the graveyard. So both of those will cause Branded in red to resolve without effect, because they didn't, it's either negated or you got rid of their target. Which means they don't fuse, which means they don't fuse with ad lib, which means this isn't summoning back anything. So that's a really interesting way and a really effective way to stop their interaction on your turn. So I think both these cards are pretty good. Bell has the added advantage of being able to hit Enchantress, and DD Crow has the advantage of being able to hit cards like Albion in the end phase. You can use this during the end phase, and you can stop this from triggering, and stop them searching a card like Branded Red. So these are both, I think, pretty solid options. Yeah, next up is Imperm, also technically Veiler, but Imperm more noteworthy. If they summon a Lubellion, this is kind of the card you want to be Imperming, because they're negging a card to pay his cost, and then when they fusion summon, if you can negate this, it makes your Albaz stuck in the graveyard. And the only way to recover an Albaz in the graveyard is Branded in Red, or to fuse with Albion, to banish it, and then you can summon a Lubellion with that effect and put it back in the deck. So if you can get the Albaz stuck in the grave, it's hard to get out, and if you can get it stuck in the banished, then it's pretty much permanently stuck there. So if you can Imperm a Lubellion, that is a great way to kind of cripple their follow-up, because they won't have an Albaz in the deck to Branded Fusion again if they only play the one copy, which I think is going to be standard. So Imperm is solid. Veiler is a similar niche, but not as much, because you can't post side, especially. There's a lot of ways to play around Veiler. You can opening in the draw phase to summon your Aliber, and that can't be Veilered, of course. You'll have more mindfulness of cards like Comedy. So I think Veiler definitely is a card you might want to main deck, but you would probably side out in the mirror match. Imperm, I think you could keep in because it's got a bit more utility. You can hit a bunch of other things with it as well. There's Shifter and Retaliating Sea next. Shifter is kind of a middling one. You would think it's really good against this deck, but it's actually not that great. Part of it is because not that many decks can play Shifter. It's pretty much only Flunder. And when this deck gets shifted, you can Branded Fusion, dump Tragedy, and Tragedy triggers on being banished, so you're still searching off of this. You'll Tragedy and Albaz, summon a Lubellion, and then the Lubellion will shuffle back the Albaz from the banished, so you're not actually like shutting off their engine at all. And you'll summon a Dragostapelia with the Albaz and the Lubellion. So you just won't summon Mirror Jade, because you can't really use this effect if Shifter is applying. So you summon Dragostapelia instead, and this card is already really good against Flunder, so you just have a massive set of problems. Shifter is like a card that you want to be playing if it like ends the game outright, and that's just not the case against this deck. Even for a time in the OCG, you saw pure Despia lists even playing their own Shifter to stop like the 10-y combo piles that they had. So this card I think is okay. It's not horrible. You shut off a lot of their cards, but you don't kill them, and that's kind of the important thing that you want Shifter to be doing. Retaliating is in a similar vein, where this card is great against Branded Fusion, but you're not stopping everything they have, and they can still summon a Dragostapelia. This cannot negate Retaliating because it only negates activated effects, and Retaliating is continuous, but you still have 8 Disrupt. And even if you summon a Mirror Jade, most decks can't play under their own Retaliating, and they have to link it off. So as soon as Retaliating is off the field, your Mirror Jade is back online again. So I think this one is also a bit sus. There's a reason you don't see this played in current format either, and it's because the Brave cards, you would think this is really good against Right, but then the Brave cards have Draco back, and Draco back will just put this back in the hand, and everything is turned on again. So it's kind of a really middling option. So yeah, and then finally is Cherries. It's hard to Cherries anything in this deck because Lubellion can put stuff back from your banished to your deck or your extra deck. So if you try to Cherries like a Mirror Jade, they'll make Lubellion, and then they'll just shuffle back like all your banished Mirror Jades and summon like a Dragostapelia, and you're fine. Because like your opponent went -1 to do a hand trap that didn't really stop you. And then if you try to Cherries like Lubellion, for example, they can summon Albion instead, and they can still make a Mirror Jade. So it's a bit irritating to try to Cherries this deck. I think at times it can be impactful, but it's kind of like people trying to play Cherries for DB in the current format. It's just not really as reliable as you want it to be. And then finally are some potential board breakers. There's many that I haven't listed here, but the most obvious ones, you can play Spell Trap Hate, so Twin Twisters, Cosmic, even Lightning Storm, to hit the Branded in Red. And while this is chainable, of course, the point is you're forcing out this card at a suboptimal time. The problem with this is that, again, Dracostapelia exists, so they don't have to go Chimera to pop stuff and just waste it. They can go Dracostapelia and then use this later. So if their end board is like a Mirror Jade plus Branded in Red, then if you try to like twin the Branded in Red, they can still just go fuse Adlib, summon Dracostapelia, summon back Mirror Jade, and then suddenly like you're down like a card or 2 cards, and they have 2 disrupts. So that's a problem. Likewise, Dark Ruler, if you're facing down the same board again, you can Dark Ruler, and then later on they'll just flip Branded red, and you're in trouble. So it's hard to really stop this deck with a board breaker. An interesting one I do want to cover before we end the video is Salesban. This is an interesting card from Battle of Chaos. It's kind of like Prohibition or Sideblocker, but it only lasts for the current turn, and you obviously can't play this in the mirror match. But the idea is you would declare a card like Adlib with Salesban, and when they brand in red, they would no longer be able to fuse with the Adlib, or if they did, they would no longer be able to trigger it in a new chain. But it has a similar problem as a card like Dark Ruler or a card like Twin Twister, where it's just like hard to actually like stop every single threat that you have with just one side card. So I think we'll see how this kind of stabilizes. I think, you know, it's going to be difficult to see how the deck stacks up because our metas are so different between the TCG and the OCG like a couple months ago. But I would expect this deck to be good. I would expect it to be good for a long time, actually, because this is a lore deck. It has more support coming out. It's new, and I think Konami's radar is more focused on like the adventure synchro piles currently than this deck. So I think it's a good investment. Oliver is definitely a problem for pricing, but overall I would expect to see a lot of these cards in the next couple months, potentially even the next half a year or so. Be on the lookout for 2 to 3 more videos coming out. I want to do a combo video for sure, and then I also want to try to commentate an OCG match of the mirror match, which I think is going to be pretty entertaining. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe. Check our description for our sponsors and our Cardmarket link, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.